Everybody, and welcome to today's Human Rights Commission hearing on conflict and hunger in Sudan. In the years since this commission was founded, we have held 9 hearings on Sudan, and this is the 10th. There have been moments of great hope: the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Accord, the 2020 Juba Agreement, but too often we meet in moments when despair is on the rise, and that is where we are today. At the beginning of 2023, Sudan was already facing record levels of humanitarian need. A third of the population, nearly 16 million people, needed assistance. 3.7 million were internally displaced, and the country was hosting over 1 million refugees from South Sudan and elsewhere. This was before war broke out on April 15, 2023, between the Sudanese Armed Forces and its former ally, the Rapid Support Forces. Since then, in the space of a year and a month, almost 9 million more people have been newly displaced, of whom 2 million have fled to neighboring countries. The United Nations now estimates that about half the population, 25 million people, need humanitarian aid. Of these, almost 18 million are estimated to face acute hunger. This is the largest hunger crisis ever recorded for Sudan during a harvest season. Experts fear that the scale and severity of hunger will escalate during the lean season from now through September. On March 20, senior UN officials warned the Security Council of a far-reaching and fast-deteriorating situation of food insecurity in Sudan that is catastrophic and truly the stuff of nightmares. On April 15, 26 humanitarian agencies urged all parties to the conflict to take immediate measures to prevent the escalation of the conflict-induced hunger crisis. I recognize that the severe humanitarian and human rights crisis that we are seeing in Sudan today is not limited to massive hunger and the beginnings of starvation. In 2007, I visited the Sudanese refugee camps along the Chad-Sudan border. From what I'm reading and what I have been told, what's happening today is as bad or even worse than the period of the early to mid-2000s. There are credible, damning reports of ethnically targeted killings, sexual violence, indiscriminate attacks in densely populated areas, looting and destruction of healthcare facilities, torture, child recruitment, and attacks on humanitarian workers, journalists, and human rights defenders. Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists are among those who have recently sounded the alarm. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has described the war as a reckless, senseless conflict taking place in a context of total impunity. But here's the thing: hunger, malnutrition, starvation, and famine have effects on survivors that persist long after wars end, generational effects. And right now, aid agencies estimate that 3.7 million children under the age of 5 are acutely malnourished. Even if a peace agreement were signed tomorrow, these children may not fully recover from the developmental consequences of malnutrition. This is simply morally inexcusable. It is also likely criminal. As this commission has emphasized in the past, and as we will be reminded today, international humanitarian law prohibits the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. The hunger crisis we are seeing today in Sudan is not mere collateral damage from hostilities. Food stores and aid warehouses have been looted. Markets have been destroyed and domestic food production devastated. Bureaucratic impediments and operational interference limit aid delivery. Civilians have been attacked as they search for food. International aid agencies have been largely unable to deliver food assistance in the capital of Khartoum, an epicenter of the conflict, and parts of Darfur have not received aid since before the war began. In other words, war crimes are among the drivers of hunger and starvation in Sudan. And as the war enters its second year, today's hearing has 3 objectives: to focus attention on what could become the world's largest hunger crisis in decades, to identify recommendations to avert a worst-case scenario of escalating starvation and famine, and to begin to discuss paths towards accountability for the actors who are deliberately contributing to hunger and starvation as part of their war strategy. I very much look forward to hearing the views of our witnesses on these 3 points. I promise to share their recommendations with Tom Perriello, the new U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan. I will, at this point, I think my co-chair is going to be a little bit late here today, but I want to go to our first panel. Is Michael Dunford of the World Food Program. He has served as Regional Director of WFP Eastern Africa Bureau based in Nairobi since June of 2020. As Regional Director, he oversees WFP operations, providing strategic guidance, supervision, and support across the region in 10 different countries. So I now welcome Mr. Dunford. He will be appearing virtually.
Thank you very much. I trust you can hear me.
I can hear you great. Thank you.
Excellent. Mr. Chair, thanks so much. And I must commend you on that excellent introduction. I fear I may be repeating some of your points, but given the gravity of the situation, I think it probably is in everybody's interest to hear them again. The World Food Program, as you know, is the world's largest humanitarian organization fighting hunger in more than 120 countries around the world. We do so thanks primarily to the generosity of the American people and your government. So I would like to recognize that from the outset. With 54 million people insecure across Eastern Africa, it is one of the most food insecure regions in the world. And the country that concerns me the most is Sudan today. The war in Sudan, which started over a year ago, is without doubt one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. It pits the Sudanese armed forces against its former ally, the Rapid Support Forces, an ethnic militia from Darfur that is now contesting control over the entire state. The war has created a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, the world's largest displacement crisis, and risk triggering the world's largest hunger crisis. The numbers, as we've already heard, and I will repeat, are staggering. Almost 18 million people in Sudan are facing high levels of acute food insecurity, which we refer to as IPC phase 5 and above, meaning they urgently need food assistance, including around 5 million people in emergency levels, IPC 4. Nearly 9 million people have been newly displaced since the conflict started, 6.7 million internally, and over 2 million people in neighboring countries, mainly who have entered South Sudan and Chad. This conflict is taking on regional dimensions, and the risks of instability for the entire region are very real. Both South Sudan and Chad are countries already grappling with immense humanitarian challenges. A staggering 7.1 million people in South Sudan out of a total population of 12 million are already acutely hungry. And now there is a further 600,000 people to feed. WFP is working tirelessly in both countries to support these governments in generously hosting refugees. In support, since the onset of the crisis, WFP has provided food to over 1 million people in the two countries. But it is Sudan itself that is of greatest concern, particularly as we lead into the lean season, which starts now and will run through until October. We will see further deterioration in the hunger levels, and this is likely to lead to malnutrition at record levels and even worse. WFP has identified 41 hunger spots that are at high risk of slipping into catastrophic or famine-like conditions in the coming months. Most of these are in access-constrained areas where conflict is raging, including in the Darfur and the Kordofans, Khartoum and Jazeera state. To meet these needs, and despite active conflict and bureaucratic hurdles, this year WFP has already distributed to 2.5 million people across 14 states with a combination of general food, cash assistance, nutritional support, school meals, and resilience building activities. In access-constrained locations, WFP has reached over 700,000 people since January with food and nutrition. It's impressive, but it simply is not enough. Our main challenge is our ability to get to those in need and to be able to do it at scale. And this is because of fighting, because of a lack of infrastructure, and regrettably due to deliberate blockages and delay tactics. Both parties have a long history of using humanitarian aid to further military and political objectives. Our worry is that this crisis will fray the social fabric of Sudan and risk dragging the entire fragile neighbourhood into a further crisis. These achievements have been under tremendous duress from WFP's team, under tremendous duress from WFP's teams and partners. There are tremendous challenges to humanitarian access, put simply, trying to reach people with the food and support that they need. Escalating fighting in northern Darfur's El Fasher in recent weeks and days has resulted in large numbers of civilian deaths and injuries, damaged the only operational hospital in the state, and hampered humanitarian access to the city and beyond. The fighting is also preventing aid convoys from getting into the city and surrounding areas. All efforts must be made to cease the fighting, not just in El Fasher, but throughout the country. Your government, as co-convener of the Jeddah 3 talks and through your special envoy, Tom Perriello, is in a unique position to use its leverage on the parties and their backers to ensure humanitarians can reach the people who need assistance, both cross-line and cross-border. Restrictions from the SAF are also preventing WFP from transporting assistance via all viable cross-border corridors. Along with the UN, WFP has requested that all cross-border routes be made available, including through Adre in Chad. Though more expensive and cumbersome, we need cross-border routes, and we need them now because we worry about the willingness of the parties to facilitate this and to allow us to do so without interference. These access constraints are jeopardizing WFP's plans to provide vital assistance to over 700,000 people ahead of the rainy seasons when the roads across Darfur become impassable. Despite these challenges, WFP is rolling out a famine prevention plan to more than double the assistance to reach over 4.6 million people across the country. But we need both the access and we need the resources to do this. WFP remains the only organization in Sudan that has the proven capacity to operate at the scale required, particularly in hard-to-reach areas. WFP has food in Sudan and across its borders to deliver to families in need and to be the logistics backbone for the rest of the humanitarian community. However, to respond to the looming famine, additional resources are urgently needed alongside freedom of movement, safety assurances, and blanket clearances to transport supplies. It is crucial that we as a global community pursue all possible avenues to reach a sustainable cessation of hostilities. A lasting ceasefire is the only solution to this crisis to address the rapidly increasing levels of hunger, displacement, and destruction that are pushing Sudan's systems to the brink of collapse. If I can leave you with a couple of final takeaways and messages. We already need to start shifting to a famine-like response, and we need your support to front-load resources and do so on a no-regrets and risk-tolerant basis. Given the critical situation, your support for adopting a much higher risk appetite is key, as it will enable WFP and others to go further and faster. Access and our footprint in country are key, and your diplomatic support for these are critical, both directly soliciting consent from the parties, but also indirectly seeking the support of influential member states to hold the parties accountable for immediately expanding access. We also need to maximize diplomatic pressure on the parties to cease fighting and the resumption of the Jeddah 3 talks, and to reach a sustainable cessation of hostilities. I would ask also that your government use its diplomatic muscle to influence those with leverage or control over the parties to get them to adhere to the commitments they have already made to let aid flow. Mr. Chair, I'd like to greatly appreciate the opportunity to brief you this morning and look forward to your support in averting the looming food security catastrophe, which is Sudan today. WFP works closely with the US government USAID, and the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and have the opportunity to collectively to make a difference. But it must happen now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. And let us. I also want to say, for the record, I want to thank WFP for its efforts, not only in Sudan but its efforts all around the world. We can't thank you enough. The world can't thank you enough. I also want to put into the record an article from the Voice of America entitled "UN Official: Real and Growing Risk of Genocide in Sudan." Ms. Dufferin, just a few questions. It's my understanding that as of this month, only 12% of the nearly $2.7 billion UN humanitarian appeal for Sudan is funded. Separately, the UN is seeking $1.4 billion for 2024 for refugee response in neighboring countries. Pledges for Sudan at the recent donors conference in Paris were more than $2 billion, is my understanding, but the breakdown is not yet available. Do you have any updates on the funding situation?
I don't have updates as it relates to the overall needs for the humanitarian sector. I know for a fact that WFP in Sudan alone requires $200 million between now and the end of the year. And it's the timeliness of that funding which is absolutely critical. We're expecting considerable support from the US government later in the year in the form of in-kind support. But what we desperately need at the moment is funding now to bridge that gap and to ensure that we have the capacity to procure food and to expand our CBT activities if and when those access challenges are overcome. And unfortunately, given what is happening globally at the moment, with the Middle East, with Ukraine and other crises, until now, Sudan has not received the level of attention it needs and deserves. Again, this hearing today is a good example of the type of efforts that are required if we're going to be able to change that scenario.
Thank you. You said that given the critical situations, support for adopting a much higher risk appetite is key. What does a higher risk appetite mean specifically, and what would change?
It would require an acceptance amongst all stakeholders that we won't have absolute control over all elements of our response, that we won't have the same provisions in place to guarantee that food is being delivered where and when it is required. We talk about a no regrets way of operating. At the moment, the most important thing would be for us to prevent the famine. The next will be to address the famine as and when it occurs. We will have the opportunity to strengthen our systems for accountability, for monitoring and others once that scale up has taken place. But we certainly cannot operate in a place like Sudan, and particularly in places like Darfur and the Kordofans, with the same levels of assurance and stringency that we would necessarily want to have under normal operating conditions.
On our next panel, we're going to hear testimony about the need to increase funding for local grassroots humanitarian efforts like the emergency response rooms. How does WFP work with local humanitarian providers, and is there room to scale up coordination with local civil society initiatives?
Absolutely. We welcome the opportunity to engage with them further. WFP is already working with the emergency response rooms and other local actors. In fact, the majority of our response is predominantly through local NGOs and others. This has huge benefits because they know the populations. They also are not necessarily restricted in the same way that we are because of security and safety consideration. But it would require a whole of system response, local actors, local NGOs, international NGOs, and the UN to be able to address what really is required at this stage.
Thank you. I'm going to yield now to Congresswoman Ilhan Omar.
I want to start by thanking the co-chairs the co-chairs for holding this important hearing. It is crucial that we keep our eyes on Sudan, and this hearing is an important part of Congress doing just that. Mr. Dunford, thank you so much for your very honest and heartbreaking remarks. The scale of suffering in Sudan is catastrophic. We're talking about tens of millions of people being displaced, facing famine, and victims of horrible violence. We've been hearing a lot about the possibility of gathering supplies on the Chad side of the border while negotiations for access to Darfur continue. Can you tell us the current state at play for the World Food Program on those negotiations, and can you update us on the World Food Program's planning and deployment of existing supplies for Darfur?
Thanks very much for the question. So WFP is obviously working closely with the authorities in Port Sudan to try and facilitate that access. We, in fact, had a plan in place that would have allowed for a substantial cross-border exchange, and that was limited when the government introduced the limitations. And at the moment, we only have one significant border crossing in a place called Tina. We have commodities on the Chad side of the border. I think off the top of my head, we probably still have a remaining 6,000 to 8,000 metric tons. We actually have, as we speak, 33 trucks with 3,000 metric tons entering Darfur. So it's not that no food is getting through. It's simply that the type of supply is irregular and is not at the scale that is required. WFP could scale further, but we wouldn't want to pre-position food unless we were guaranteed to be able to bring it across. So I was on a call this morning with the team. I think we've had, in the first 5 months of the year, 3 separate operational plans that are constantly having to be updated based on what it is we are facing on a daily basis in the sphere of operation. And I suspect before the end of this month, there will be yet another operational plan. The situation is constantly evolving. WFP is trying to respond to that. And as I said at the beginning, we have the capacity, but we need to be able to scale this operation almost on an industrial level. And to do so, we desperately need additional funding.
And can you say a little bit about whether there is challenges in distribution once you're able to get aid in?
Regrettably, yes. The answer is yes. And it's because of the ongoing conflict. It's because many of our facilities were disrupted at the beginning of the conflict. WFP had over 40,000 metric tons of food looted. Most of our offices in the Darfurs and other conflict-affected areas were damaged or destroyed. We lost warehousing, we lost trucking capacity. So we're having to rebuild all of these elements. It's then about trying to access the populations where they are. Many of them being displaced, as I said at the beginning, 6.7 million people have been displaced by this crisis. So it's then about trying to establish our operations where those populations have moved to. And then if this insecurity increases, often those populations will move and we'll have to follow them down the road.
Yeah. As attention is rightfully focused on the looming disaster in Al Fashir, we also need to continue to pay attention to the situation in the rest of the country. We've heard that in some cases it's been months since the people in Kordofan and Khartoum have gotten food or medical supplies. What is the status of the supply lines from South Sudan?
So at the moment, we're prohibited to bring large-scale food across from South Sudan. We do have some commodities moving across with one of our NGO partners into Blue Nile State in the 2 areas. but it again is not at the scale. You talked about Khartoum. Yes, we are delivering into Khartoum, but not at the scale. And this is where the frustration really arises. This is where there are desperate populations who need support and are not getting it. And that's why we are now working with the likes of the emergency rooms that you've heard mentioned earlier, and why we are continuing to explore opportunities with a whole range of different partners to be able to meet the needs of the population. Despite what we have achieved, we estimate we are probably only on a regular basis reaching 10 to 20% of the population in the hardest to reach areas. So it is, in my mind, as a corporate response director and a regional director for WFP, I'm definitely not satisfied yet as to where we are, and we will continue to do everything we can to raise our response.
You alluded to being prohibited. Can you say who you're prohibited by?
We're limited by to different parts of the country. We're limited by different actors. That includes the SAF, the government in Port Sudan, that has included at different times the RSF. And then there are other militia groups who are operating that we often neither need to negotiate access to or who are preventing. Law and order is also a big concern. You may have seen a report last week that 3 ICRC staff were killed. At the beginning of the conflict, WFP itself lost 3 staff. So, you know, there are a whole range of different considerations and actors that are limiting our ability to scale the operation. We are constantly trying to resolve these issues. That's one of the reasons why I've asked support from your special envoy and your government to continue to work with all actors and stakeholders to facilitate the humanitarian access that we require.
You mentioned Port Sudan. What do the supply lines running through there look like?
So Port Sudan obviously is the largest port in the country and where WFP is bringing most of the commodities through. From there, we organize convoys to different parts of the country, keeping in mind that to the north and to the east, southeast, there generally is good access, and that is where most of the activities are happening. We are also trying to organize cross-line either to the Darfurs or perhaps down to Kosti, into Khartoum, but this is where it becomes increasingly complicated because there we need to go cross-line, and this is negotiations with multiple actors to ensure that we are ultimately able to reach the populations requiring the assistance.
Yeah. As somebody who comes from the region, I'm concerned about the rainy season that's approaching. Wanted to know if you all have a contingency plan for roads that become impassable or washed out from the rain.
Yeah, I'm sitting in Nairobi, it's raining as I speak, and I know that the situation in many of the countries that we are reaching, and particularly into Sudan and the neighbors, you know, if not already, it certainly is going to change in the coming weeks. That is just going to make the work of WFP and others even more complicated. So yes, we are developing contingency plans. There are different roads that we will be able to take, but equally, and as you've indicated, it will make the challenge that much greater at this point.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. We look forward to trying to find possible ways to get our government to do a little bit more. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Mr. Dunford, thank you again. We appreciate you taking the time. This has been very helpful, and it reminds us that this is a horrifically tragic situation that, quite frankly, deserves a lot more attention by the world community. And we will, hopefully we can continue to stay in touch with you, and if you have any recommendations, that you will feel free to reach out to us as well.
Chair, thank you very much. And I do appreciate that you have put Sudan on your agenda. I think we've had a good conversation, a good discussion. Certainly the World Food Programme will be doing everything it can We appreciate the support that we've received from the US government. I'll put in a plug for additional support if possible. But really, you're our strongest partner, our strongest funder, and you are the government that potentially has the muscle to really move the agenda at this point. So if there's anything that we can do in support, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Well, thank you very much. And again, we want to salute WFP and your entire team. It is dangerous and difficult to do this work, and we are grateful. So thank you so much. And we will now go to our second panel. Avril Benoit is the Executive Director of Doctors Without Borders, and in the United States, MSF USA. Throughout her career with MSF, Avril has contributed to major movement-wide initiatives, including the global mobilization to end attacks on hospitals and health workers. Haneen Ahmed is an activist for women's and youth rights who holds a master's degree in gender and development from Afad University for Women. She helped to establish an emergency response room in her home city of Omdurman in order to serve the most basic needs of Sudanese citizens. Dr. Ashraf Afan is a Sudanese-American pediatrician who is known for his work as the founder of the Angel Kids Foundation, an organization that focuses on addressing social determinants of health for underserved children and their families in the greater Jacksonville area. His passion for children issues extends beyond the USA to global concerns. And Tom Denenbaum is Associate Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where he's also co-director of the Center for International Law and Governance. He writes about the law of armed conflict, international criminal law, and human rights. And I want to thank our panelists for being with us. And I will begin with Ms. Benoit.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, and I hope you can hear me all right.
We can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Great. I'm Avril Benoit, and Co-Chair McGovern and Co-Chair Smith, thanks so much for this opportunity to discuss the worsening crisis in Sudan. I represent Doctors Without Borders, which is known internationally as Médecins Sans Frontières, and that's where we get the acronym MSF. We're an independent international medical humanitarian organization providing medical assistance in more than 70 countries, and we really focus on places where there's armed conflict, epidemics, disasters, and exclusion from healthcare. We've been working in Sudan since 1979, and we've responded to some of the worst crises that have plagued the country, including in Darfur roughly 20 years ago. And now we have 1,300 staff members on the ground, mostly Sudanese, some internationally. We're operating in 9 states, including 4 of the 5 Darfur regions. Our medical teams on the ground are providing emergency medical treatment, carrying out trauma surgery, cesarean sections, and running mobile clinics for displaced people. We're also providing payments to Ministry of Health staff who have not been paid for the better part of a year. So we're treating communicable and non-communicable diseases, providing maternal and pediatric health care, and responding to surging rates of malnutrition among children and pregnant and lactating women. Since the armed conflict broke out in April of last year between the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, what was a collection of localized humanitarian crises quickly evolved into an all-consuming humanitarian catastrophe. For 13 months, people in Sudan have suffered through relentless violence, displacement, and hunger, all the while their access to medical and humanitarian assistance they don't so desperately require has been systematically strangled. Regrettably, all indicators point to the current crisis only growing broader and deeper, with famine looming, ethnic violence intensifying. The violence between the warring parties was unleashed on civilians in Sudan in a way that was completely unrestrained. They have regularly trampled the legal and normative frameworks that shield civilians from the worst effects of armed conflict. The RSF and the SAF have engaged in both targeted and indiscriminate violence against civilians, including in densely populated areas in the big cities. So our teams have tended to thousands of conflict-related injuries. And since violence has spiked in Al-Fashir on May 10th, our colleagues in the South Hospital have tended to over 700 wounded, including many women and children. Nearly 12% of the war-wounded patients our teams received in the hospital over the last 11 days have died from their wounds. Between August 2023 and March 2024, the MSF-supported Al-Now Hospital in Omdurman treated over 6,000 patients for conflict-related trauma. In the month of February, women and children made up 20% of war-wounded patients. The violence has led to a spike in mortality. Across the border in eastern Chad, where I was recently, MSF carried out retrospective mortality surveys on refugees who had escaped the unspeakable violence brought upon them by RSF in Darfur in August and September of last year. The crude mortality rates were 20 times higher than before April 15th. 80% of recent deaths in those communities were the result of violence. Sudan's already fragile health system is collapsing. Essential medical supplies are scarce. The armed groups have looted, militarized, and attacked health facilities and medical warehouses. Healthcare worker availability is also severely limited due to displacement, insecurity, and unpaid salaries. Over 70% of medical facilities in the conflict-affected areas are no longer operational. According to the World Health Organization, 65% of the population lacks access to health care. In many locations, obstetrical care is unavailable. Immunizations have ground to a halt, and infectious diseases, including cholera and measles, are on the rise, and consequences are horrific and will undoubtedly be enduring. In parts of Sudan, malnutrition is alarmingly high. Our teams in North Darfur work in Zamzam, a camp for internally displaced people. There, we carried out 2 recent malnutrition assessments revealing catastrophic malnutrition rates. In January, we found almost a quarter of the children screened were acutely malnourished, with 7% suffering from severe acute malnutrition, SAM. Among children aged 6 months to 2 years, 15% were severely malnourished. In early March, another mass screening of 46,000 that we carried out in the same camp in Zamzam found that 30% of those screened had acute malnutrition, with 8% having severe acute malnutrition, a life-threatening condition requiring specialized therapeutic treatment. And of course, the drivers of all this food insecurity and malnutrition in Sudan are many. Farmers cannot reach their lands for fear of being attacked. Local markets are disrupted. There's often looting that happens. Cash shortages are widespread. Food prices are spiking, and access to primary health care is severely limited. However, for over a year now, the humanitarian response across Sudan has been systematically obstructed. Government officials in Port Sudan routinely deny granting movement permits for transferring humanitarian supplies and staff across borders and across front lines. And this leaves many civilians without the assistance. Last week, Doctors Without Borders took the painful decision to suspend our support to one of our few functioning health facilities in Wad Madani, the Madani Teaching Hospital, due to our inability to resupply the hospital and to ensure the safety of our patients and staff. Since October of last year, we've been unable to rotate humanitarian teams or resupply health facilities we support in South Khartoum due to denied travel permits. From mid-October through December of last year, we had to suspend life-saving activities in the Al-Bashir hospital after military authorities blocked the transport of surgical materials to the area. While the people of North Darfur grow hungrier and sicker, we have not been able to resupply our facilities for over a month, one administrative obstruction after another. And these access issues persist despite continuous engagement with authorities and repeated assurances from political and military leaders who keep telling us, yes, yes, just wait. MSF does not accept US government funding. But in Sudan, we work alongside many USAID partners. We welcomed the passage of the supplemental funding. We need that scaled humanitarian response, but it cannot be built in Sudan without adequate US resourcing, so we appreciate that. However, the required response cannot be built on funding alone. We are facing deeply entrenched access restrictions, the persistence of which will keep humanitarian response in its current anemic state. Without a dramatic increase and immediate change on the access front, people in Sudan will slip further into hunger, disease, and destitution. I thank you very much for paying attention to this issue. We publish more information on doctorswithoutborders.org, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ahmed.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Hanin Ahmed. On the second day of war, April 16, 2023, I joined the other young people to address the most pressing needs of our community. We organized an emergency response room for central section of Omdurman, my home city, on the west bank of the River Nile, opposite the capital of Khartoum, and for the whole capital in a week later. Who we are emergency response room. We are the first responders who are growing number of volunteers, professional, technician, community members, activists, and resistance committee. We are grassroots. We are working on our neighborhood among our communities. We are agile. We are immediately respond and stay creative by changing our tools according to our needs. We are recognized by OCHA, USAID, and other international as a humanitarian aid actors. Neutrally, we strictly humanitarian and non-political. We do not favor any side. We aim to provide mutual aid based on localized solidarity economy through partnership with the local and international NGOs and organizations. Our principle, we adopted the following fundamental principle of good governance, accountability to our community and our partners, participation, we provide the services for us, transparency, open sources sharing of our data, equality in providing services and sharing resources, and in participation as well. We have a structured body from Legislative Council. We have 3 members of each locality. We have a working group. This is our executive working group. What we provide food, health services, gender-based violence, and other critical services. We have 398 soup kitchens. We have 40 health facilities clinic. We have 75 women co-ops. Why emergency response room? Because emergency response room are the only group that reach citizens in this critical time. We face a lot of challenges, financial resources. We do not have the resources to accomplish our critical mission, thus the need for partnership. Social, losing the trust and participation of our communities, thus need for transparency and communication. Security risk, our members are subjected to harassment, rape, and arbitrarily arrested by both sides, with each side accusing us working as intelligence for the other side. Therefore, we have maintaining our neutrality when it comes to the warring parties. We received almost daily report of deaths at rate of 3 to 4 cases per day due to hunger, so we can say famine exists. Our internet services come in and out, preventing us from reaching volunteers in our emergency response room, soup kitchens, evacuation centers, and making shift schools. The lack of internet connectivity prevents us from transferring monies through electronic bank application, meaning our volunteer cannot purchase food for the soup kitchen without internet access. Citizens cannot receive allowance from their relative in diaspora, which means they too become reliant on our soup kitchens. Further, we experiencing a spike in inflation. Thus, the U.S. government can help by finding ways to provide significant adaptable funding for the emergency response room, free of overly patriotic requirements and fit for the realities on the ground of working with the conflict environment. The emergency response room reports monitoring and accountability system. We are desperately need more staff, supplies, and medicine. We need assistance in improving training and capacity building. We also need enhanced ability to communicate and coordinate among ourselves with allies and partners. Donors can facilitate a bottom-up process that gives ownership to the emergency response room and allows Sudanese citizens to determine how the best allocate resources. Emergency response room workers and human rights defenders are being directly targeted, and diplomatic efforts are needed to push the conflict parties to case such actions. The United States should work with the other countries of influence to recognize emergency response room as protected humanitarian workers and command any attack on the emergency response room as well, and any shutdowns of the electricity and internet that hinder our ability to do our job. Reports humanitarian funding for Sudan in your fiscal years 2025 budget is vital, but it's important to recognize that aid delivery is not possible if people do not feel safe. Protection of the civilian, including humanitarian aid workers, are responders, and responders has to be a priority. As we gather today, civilians in Al-Fashir, in the capital of North Darfur, are in immediate danger of mass atrocities. It's essential that administration and Congress act swiftly at the UN, in the region, and Sudan to address this threat. The U.S. government must use its power to put a pressure on a party to prevent a catastrophe in Al-Fashir. A ceasefire in Sudan is essential to feed our people. Planning and harvesting are prevented by the ongoing violence. The Congress should ensure that the administration has a clear, specific, and unified strategy on Sudan that engages Sudanese civil society. In conclusion, I wish to express my thanks to Chairman McGovern for his attendance in the United for Sudan rally at the White House last month. I encourage all members of the committee to use your platform to elevate the concerns of Sudanese people. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for your excellent testimony. Dr. Afan?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Mr. Chairman, distinguished attendees and speakers, let me thank you first for putting this catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Sudan on the spotlight. Angel Kids Foundation was established back in 2017 as a non-for-profit organization under the umbrella of Angel Kids Pediatrics, with a clear mission to support families facing multitude of challenges. The foundation is dedicated to addressing issues such as poverty, unemployment, mental health, and access to health care that impacts the families in the greater Jacksonville area. Over the years, The foundation has made significant strides in achieving positive outcomes through its various initiatives aimed at improving the well-being of children and families in need in Jacksonville and Northeast Florida region. As a Sudanese American pediatrician who cared for children throughout my career, it was a call for action for us at Angel Kids Foundation to respond to the crisis children and their families are facing in Sudan. Please allow me to repeat what some of my colleagues just repeated, but I'm going to focus on children. And it's very important that the entire world needs to know the magnitude of this catastrophe in Sudan. So I'm going to just repeat some of this information again. The war in Sudan ensued on April 15th, 2023, between the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, aka Janjaweed Militia, and the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, devastating more than 47 million people, making Sudan the world's most catastrophic humanitarian emergency in recent history. I will focus on the effect of the war on children and women. About 2 million Sudanese, it has already been said, mostly women and children, crossed the borders to neighboring countries to become refugees in South Sudan, almost 658,000, in Chad, 588,000, and Egypt, more than 500,000. Rape, forced marriages, sexual exploitation, and trafficking are the atrocious incumbent crimes committed against women and girls in Sudan, with Khartoum, Darfur, Kordofan states have the highest incidence rates. 3 million women and girls are at risk of such horrific transgression. Reporting of such attacks remains significantly low due to the fear of cultural stigma and social repercussions, in addition to skepticism in the integrity of the national authorities, which indicate that such catastrophic violations are exponentially high and their physical and mental consequences are disastrous. It is reported by children relief NGOs that 230,000 Sudanese children and young women and their mothers are facing imminent starvation and care death, and Khartoum state is classified as IDP famine. About 3.7 million, as Mr. Chairman alluded, that 3.7 million children under 5 are suffering severe malnutrition. A child passes away every 2 hours in Zamzam camp in North Darfur. Greater Darfur, Greater Kordofan, Khartoum, Jazeera state are the most affected with severe food insecurity. 1.7 million children under 1 year are threatened by vaccine-preventable diseases due to the disconnection of immunization activities. Communicable diseases and elevated emergencies due to non-communicable disease complications have been and are still being reported. Half of the displaced population are children, almost 4 million. 7 million children, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 4 boys are not receiving education, unfortunately. Prolonged interruption of education process in Sudan has disastrous implications on children, elevating the chances of sexual abuse, child marriage, child labor, child pregnancy, child military recruitment. Violence and lack of community social cohesion at this point as a result of the war led to catastrophic mental distress among youth. And this is a very important point that I wanted to just tell you what Angel Kids Foundation is doing as a response to these mental issues. So what we are doing at Angel Kids Foundation, we have launched a program led by mental health experts and professors on trauma impact prevention training, as this is what we do here in the United States. This program aims at providing mental health practitioners, frontline staff, and crisis responders with necessary skills, knowledge to address the psychosocial impact of trauma on children, families, and communities in war conflict zones. By empowering individuals with trauma-focused training and strategies, the program seeks to mitigate the adverse effects of trauma and promote healing and resilience among affected population. Generational trauma is a serious issue, being overlooked by many people, especially for Darfur people who are going through a third catastrophic war within the last 20 years. First one was 2003, 2011, 12, and now it's 2023. Furthermore, the foundation is actively screening credible partners in the field who work with children to implement the trauma impact prevention training program and provide technical assistance where is needed. Additionally, the foundation is leveraging technology by developing a geospatial command center to enhance coordination and communication among various NGOs operating in Sudan right now, and for the few of them that are still in the field working. This innovative approach aims to streamline data collection, reporting, overall humanitarian response efforts, and ensuring a more efficient and coordinated response to the need of children and families affected by the conflict. In conclusion, Angel Kids Foundation commitment to supporting vulnerable families and children in crisis situation in Sudan is of high priority. Through its strategic initiatives and partnership, the foundation is hoping to make a tangible difference in the lives of those affected by the conflict in Sudan, offering hope and support to face the adversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will now turn to Professor Dannenbaum.
Thank you, co-chairs McGovern and Smith, for the privilege to appear again before this commission. As we've heard today, the ongoing conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and rapid support forces is devastating Sudan. In my remarks, I'll focus on the law related to one major component of this horror, that of weaponized starvation. But that should not detract from the gravity and the criminality of the killing, destruction, ethnic cleansing, rape and sexual violence, attacks on journalists, and other abuses perpetrated in this war, including in the RSF's current assault on al-Fasher. Actions by both the SAF and the RSF are key drivers of the situation that has been described today, in which Sudan is facing the world's worst hunger crisis. We've heard many of the numbers already: 18 million people in acute food insecurity, 5 million at emergency levels, 4 million children suffering acute malnutrition, 730,000 severe acute malnutrition. Many face a slow death. Until relatively recently, legal attention to the infliction of this form of human suffering in war was either absent or marginal in comparison to that applied to more strikingly violent forms of killing and mistreatment. That marginalization was a mistake. Starvation methods in war inflict profound and enduring suffering, a tearing at human society that is properly characterized as torturous, immediate and long-term impacts on health, and ultimately death. These effects are disproportionately harmful and lethal to children. Slowly, the law has changed to respond to this reality. Today, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. There is a framework of accountability, and the starvation ban is at the center of the UN Security Council's work on the protection of civilians. But that framework of prohibition, accountability, and prevention has been underutilized. Now is the moment to build momentum in changing that. Let me just briefly explain the starvation prohibition in international humanitarian law, discuss the accountability framework, and suggest steps forward in response to the situation in Sudan and more broadly. International humanitarian law is built on the fundamental idea that even in war, when the stakes are at their greatest, there are red lines past which no belligerent may traverse. With the codification of the Geneva Convention's additional protocols in 1977 and the development of related customary law, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare was recognized as one of those red lines. Specifically, it is prohibited to engage in the deprivation of what the law terms objects indispensable to civilian survival, such as food, medicine, water, or the systems that underpin them, either for the purpose of denying those objects sustenance value or for any other purpose if civilians will starve as a result. That prohibition covers the range of methods deployed by RSF and SAF fighters, such as attacking food markets, destroying crops and livestock, attacking aid workers, looting food, and impeding humanitarian delivery. US Special Envoy Tom Perriello has argued correctly that such violations of international humanitarian law are leading to a famine of choice. Since the codification of the Rome Statute in 1998 and the associated development of customary law, it's become clear that these are war crimes for which individuals can be prosecuted. And yet, until 6 to 7 years ago, that war crime has been largely overlooked. The key now is to build on growing attention to that crime, spotlight the moral toxicity of starvation methods in war, and invigorate the system of accountability. That also means going beyond war crimes to include crimes against humanity and, where applicable, genocide, so as to capture discriminatory animus, scale, and lethality as applied to starvation methods. But these legal frameworks do not apply themselves. They need attention, implementation, and institutional support. With Security Council Resolution 2417, there is a framework for keeping this at the top of the Security Council's agenda, including through emergency briefings, as was done for Sudan on March 20th, following a white note from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Resolution 2417 also emphasizes the possibility of adopting targeted sanctions, and it can be used to frame and motivate other preventive and accountability measures. It should be a top priority to carefully evaluate the viability and likely impact of each of those possible mechanisms and to use them where appropriate. It is also important that all states, including the United States, ratify the treaties codifying the prohibition on starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and incorporate the starvation war crime into their national codes, thereby expressing a commitment to ending this practice and enabling domestic courts to play the full and appropriate role that is outlined for them in accountability for war crimes. International courts, too, can play a key role where they have jurisdiction. The International Criminal Court currently has jurisdiction in Darfur on the basis of a 2005 UN Security Council referral, but it is unclear whether this extends to the rest of Sudan and whether it covers the starvation war crime. The United States could lead a new Security Council referral to clarify those points. Alternatively, it would be appropriate to consider facilitating a path to a hybrid court. Finally, war crimes investigators need evidence, resources, access, and protection. That requires principled leadership and respect for the integrity of the judicial process. It is time to make accountability for starvation crimes a priority in Sudan and globally, and I'm grateful for the work of this commission in elevating the attention to this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your testimony. I have a few questions, and I'll just go through them quickly here. Ms. Benoit, I saw a report this morning that MSF has evacuated its staff from El Fasher as of today. Is that correct? And if you can confirm that, and if so, can you explain why?
Yes, I don't have all the details of who exactly has been evacuated, but for sure they've been in a very difficult situation since the 10th of the month, with a lot of bombardment, the need to stay in a safe room, to try to stay away from the blasts. Evacuation, I know, is a fraught issue in Sudan, and in that region in particular, there are a lot of people who would have liked to leave the region, including a lot of internally displaced people from the area, people who have been rounding themselves up with their families in El Fasher because they felt they had nowhere else to go. And so whether they're in Zamzam camp, which is a bit of a distance away, or El Fasher itself, it's not really been very easy in this war for civilians to be able to escape. So I can't really comment on the specific details of any movement that we have successfully made, or the arrangements that would have been required to get that done. But for sure, it's something that creates a lot of uncertainty for a medical program that's trying to continue delivering aid, supporting hospitals, supporting the clinics in the camp, when you have an inability for a lot of people to actually escape safely. It is one of our many calls for the government in terms of ensuring, whether it's an area controlled by the SAF, military intelligence, any of the attendant groups supporting them, to allow civilians to leave, and we count ourselves and our staff among those.
Well, we pray for their safety, and we certainly appreciate their work. And for the record, can you please describe the long-term effects of malnutrition on those who survive it, and in particular on children?
Yes, malnutrition is one of those things that that can cause, when it becomes severe, organ failure. So in addition to the kind of wasting that you can have, where, say, for example, children under 5 become very, very thin, you can also have edema and issues of almost like a swelling. All in all, when the malnutrition is on the rise, you can expect stunting of growth, and growth not only physical, but in terms of cognitive growth. For young children, this can be catastrophic. We're also very concerned about the effects on pregnant and lactating women, because when you do not have food distributions coming in, when they're trying to make do, often with trying to scrounge around to find some sustenance for themselves, women often don't prioritize themselves. Even when they're pregnant or lactating, they will prioritize their children. They'll prioritize those that they perceive as more vulnerable. But for that gestational health, and certainly once an infant is born, for a young child that has no other source of food but the breast milk, that's vital, not only for the mom to be able to produce it, but obviously for the children. And so that's one of the reasons that we prioritize that group as well.
Thank you. Ms. Ahmed, how do the emergency response rooms, the ERRs, how do ERRs obtain supplies for the food kitchens? And have you been able to continue to supply the kitchens?
We are obtaining our necessities from closer markets, but as I mentioned, it's put our volunteer in danger. Some ERR found certain suppliers to deal with them, but it generally depends on the locality context, because it's different from locality to other, whether it's controlled by SAF or RSF. And for why, have we able to continue to supply our soup kitchens? As I mentioned, the challenges sometimes hindered us from continue our work, such as financial and security challenges. Right now we have 10 kitchen tried in Bahri because the volunteers are being arrested by RSF.
And how do ERRs interact with international humanitarian organizations, aid organizations? Is there a humanitarian cluster that you participate in? Do you share information with other humanitarian initiatives?
Yes, we have early coordination with OSHA, IRC, DRC, and NRC, and other international actors. We founded something also called Localization Hub, which is included other ERR from different states and local organization. We have only right now international organization, Save Our World. Of course, we are a member of WASH and Health Cluster to sharing information with others.
Thank you. Mr. Irfan, does your foundation have staff presence in Sudan, and how do you interact or coordinate with other humanitarian initiatives in the country?
Yes, thank you for the question. So far, we don't have staff. We work through trusted partners who are working on children and women and families in Sudan. We have a couple of partners that we have been working with, like Hayat charitable organization and other organizations as well, that we are relying on them to conduct the work that is focused on our mandates here for our organization.
And what are the biggest challenges or obstacles that you face in sustaining the foundation's work in Sudan?
Well, so far, because we are new to the Sudan work versus our work here established in the United States, building a coalition of Sudanese people, which is an important point that I wanted to also get some help from the group here, is we have almost 50,000 professional Sudanese Americans, diaspora people who are really right now, unfortunately, in a status of shock, but everybody is happy and willing and they want to help. They needed some coordination. They needed some organization under one task force to be able to provide the expertise, the help, the volunteerism that they are willing to do in Sudan. So funding is one of the issues for us, as well as being able to transfer money back to Sudan to all the operators in the field. As my colleague, Ms. Ahmed said, there is a system for a money transfer, something similar to Zelle in US here. It's a banking, e-banking system has been completely shut off because of the internet availability in the country. So from time to time, even people cannot send money to any organization working over there to buy supplies from the market or even feeding their own families if they want to do. So those are some of the challenges that we have so far.
Thank you. Professor Dannenbaum, you mentioned that UN Security Council Resolution 2417, the resolution that elevated the prohibition on the use of starvation as a weapon of war, allows for the adoption of targeted sanctions and could be used to frame and motivate other preventive and accountability measures. So President Biden's 2023 executive order authorizing sanctions for actions that destabilize Sudan lists violations of IHL and obstructing the delivery of humanitarian assistance as grounds for sanctions. Would using the executive order to sanction individuals specifically for blocking the delivery of food aid be an example of using sanctions to frame other accountability measures?
Yes, it absolutely could be. Just to be very clear, the United Nations Security Council had the authority to engage in these kinds of mechanisms independent of 2417. Yeah. But what 2417 did was bring to the fore of the protection of civilians work of the United Nations Security Council the issue of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and the impediment of humanitarian relief. So now there is a particular framing mechanism and a system through which this can be brought to the Security Council as a matter of urgency, and then the Security Council can act on it. What you just mentioned there were US sanctions, right, and those can also be implemented, whether under the UN Security Council framework or not. But absolutely, there are a full range of possible measures for prevention and ultimately accountability. And a key question in deciding whether to implement one or the other is listening to the humanitarian organizations and actors on the ground with respect to what they think will be effective in facilitating their work. But legally, that authority is there.
And just for the record, does the nature of a conflict, whether it's international or non-international, have an impact on possibilities for accountability?
It does currently at the International Criminal Court. Yeah. So there are various routes through which one can pursue accountability. In domestic courts exercising universal jurisdiction, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is criminalized in many domestic legal codes, not the United States, but many other domestic legal codes, whether it's an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. At the International Criminal Court, it was initially limited to international armed conflicts. That changed with a 2019 amendment that extended this war crime to non-international armed conflicts. But ordinarily, the amendment regime in the International Criminal Court applies only as specific states ratify the amendment. In other words, the amendment does not just become generally applicable to all states within the ICC system. It's a little bit legally ambiguous how to account for the application of an amendment in the context of a situation that is not a situation involving a state party to the ICC, but instead a state that has been brought through the ICC system via a Security Council referral, which is the situation in Sudan, specifically with respect to Darfur. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there, and that's why I suggested that a further Security Council referral could clarify both the applicability of ICC crimes to the entirety of Sudan, not just Darfur, and second, that starvation of civilians as a method of warfare would be applicable, even though this is a non-international armed conflict, as the designation is applied under international law.
Right. And what kind of evidence or documentation is necessary to demonstrate that hunger is more than collateral damage? I mean, what should we be looking for?
So there are two key elements when you're thinking about the war crime of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. One is the deprivation of objects indispensable to civilian survival. So you have to establish that objects indispensable to civilian survival are being deprived to civilians. That could be through, as I said, attacks on food systems, it could be looting, it could be the impediment of humanitarian access. But that's the first element, is showing that conduct that is depriving civilians of objects indispensable to their survival. The second component is showing intent. Exactly how the intent threshold is going to be applied under the International Criminal Court statute is not entirely clear because this crime has not yet been prosecuted. But ordinarily under the ICC statute, there are two forms of intent. One is purposive intent, and the other is what lawyers would call oblique intent. The first is about acting with the purpose to starve civilians or to deprive them of sustenance. And the second would be acting in this way, depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival, in the knowledge that there is a virtual certainty that they will starve as a result of that deprivation. So if you can show one or the other of those combined with those acts of deprivation, then the crime would attach. And we clearly have the acts of deprivation in this particular instance, and I think it's quite likely that there is strong evidence of intent.
Let me close with an observation and a question, and anybody who wants to can answer this. All of you or none of you if you want. But the messages that I'm taking away from this hearing are that we need to be shouting from the rooftops about the growing crisis of hunger and the risk of famine, and more generally the need for civilian protections. It's past time to significantly increase pressure and leverage on all relevant parties to ensure humanitarian access, both cross-line and cross-border. The U.S. government must sustain and ideally increase its humanitarian funding for Sudan and surrounding countries. We should be laying the groundwork to pursue accountability for those using starvation as a weapon of war. And the United States should, park a drone above El Fasher and announce that we're watching. Am I missing anything? I open this up to anybody wants to. If you raise your hand, I'll call on you.
We certainly have a number of things that we would like to see happen, both from the side of the government of Sudan, but also for those states that are involved, because this is not just an internal civil war. There are others that, we're a medical humanitarian organization. It's not like we are necessarily following all the details of it, but there's a particular investment and responsibility for the UAE, for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for Chad, for Egypt, to increase the pressure on the warring parties to abide by their obligations regarding civilian protection and international humanitarian law. We really hope that for the African Union and IGAD, that all possible means and actions are taken to reestablish some kind of mechanism for protection of civilians. There are a lot of potential solutions and certainly improvements that could come from a greater serious involvement in working with the government of Sudan, such as it is, but also with the RSF, because for sure we are seeing obstructions on a scale that are unacceptable and causing a tremendous amount of suffering. And we're also, of course, very worried about the people of El Fasher. We're trying to continue our programs, even if international staff are on the move and trying to make their way to the Tine border of Chad. But we will be very much willing to come back and reestablish that international presence as soon as it's possible to do so. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Efan?
Yes, thank you. And I think I would like to see the U.S. government using its diplomatic muscles as well as any other muscle that they can use in regard to stopping the war. I know this is, a big issue. U.S. has been in the talks of peace in Jeddah from the beginning of it. It has been going on and off, but I think stopping the war is what's going to open all the doors for us to work on the humanitarian and salvage the country and the future of the country when it comes to its children and the families as well.
Ms. Ahmed?
Yeah, in regard for this, I have a question for you. Do you have any efforts, unified efforts toward countries that's fueling the conflict in Sudan?
Well, I think we are, I think that's one of the things I think the administration is trying to pursue with our special envoy, Mr. Perriello, who's advising us, but I take your point. No, I think there needs, look, I mean, part of the reason why we're doing this hearing is I think that we need to focus more attention on what's happening in Sudan, you know, in the United States Congress. I mean, given the enormity of the tragedy that we see unfolding, I think more attention needs to be focused on that. And as was mentioned in the, I forgot whose maybe opening statement, but I mean, there are a lot of crises going on in the world, but what's happening here is, you know, is just, is beyond awful. I mean, and I inserted in the record an article where UN officials referring to this as a genocide. So, but there needs to be more attention on this topic. And the United States Congress needs to be talking about it a lot more, and not just in the Human Rights Commission, but in, you know, in a number of forums that are available to us here. Professor?
Yes, thank you, Co-Chair McGovern. I think was mentioned earlier by, I think Ms. Benoit mentioned this, the importance of involving also the African Union here. And I just wanted to emphasize that as a matter of legal authority, the African Union actually has many of the same kinds of authority as the United Nations, in particular through Article 4H of the African Union Constitutive Act. The African Union Assembly has significant powers, and so invoking those and acting in response to this crisis with the kind of response that it demands is itself an important component of the overall reaction to the situation, and the United States could help facilitate that through diplomatic engagement. The other thing that I just wanted to emphasize, which is less part of the urgent response to this situation, but is part of the response to the fact that these situations are happening across multiple different conflict zones and therefore require a strengthening of the legal framework overall, I would advocate that the United States take seriously the prospect of ratifying the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, engaging in a powerful way with the ongoing negotiations at the United Nations regarding a Crimes Against Humanity treaty, and also with the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, the Ljubljana-Hague Treaty that was agreed in 2023. And in thinking about engaging across those different dimensions, as well as incorporating starvation of civilians as a method of warfare into the US War Crimes Act, 18 U.S.C. 2441, which was recently, as you're aware, expanded to include jurisdiction over persons who committed crimes outside the United States against victims who are not US nationals, where they, the perpetrators, were also not US nationals, and to eliminate statutes of limitations, but has not yet been updated to include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. So I would advocate that the United States take those kinds of steps. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I just, you know, for the record, I joined on legislation yesterday that would prohibit U.S. arms sales to UAE until it stops providing material support to the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, in Sudan, as a way to, again, try to put pressure on other countries to do more. No, I appreciate everybody's testimony. I appreciate all the work that you are involved in, and my hope is that we can, again, focus more attention and try to figure out more ways to bring this conflict to an end and to prevent this massive starvation. You know, sometimes I worry because this conflict is complicated, and there are no easy, quick fixes, that sometimes people turn the other way because this is a tough thing to try to find a way to bring to an end. But again, the number of deaths, the number of people who are without food, who are on the verge of starvation, is really quite, it's astonishing. And the world community needs to do more. I think we need to do more here in the United States. You know, I want to note that we expect statements from, for the record, from Human Rights Watch and Search for Common Ground, and when they come in, we will submit them for the record. And I think I'm going to, this is kind of an unusual thing, but I have to go to the House floor, but we have another member of Congress coming, and so I'm going to suggest that maybe we recess for like 5 minutes, if that's okay, if you could stay with us for 5 minutes. If you can, I understand, but I want to make sure Mr. Bilirakis can get his questions in, and I think he may be coming shortly. Oh, here he is here. Okay, we don't have to recess. So I'm going to well, I go to the House floor to debate something not nearly as consequential as what we're talking about here today. I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Bilirakis for any statements and questions he may have, and when he is done, he can close this hearing.
Okay.
All right?
Sounds good.
All right. Again, let me just say to the panelists, thank you, thank you, thank you. Again, I appreciate your work and your dedication to this, and we will stay in touch. So, Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. We've had, let me shut this off. But we've had several hearings at once, quite a few conflicts, but this is so very important. A sincere thank you again to the co-chairs, Mr. McGovern and my good friend Chris Smith, for hosting the hearing today. What's happening in Sudan today is an unmitigated humanitarian crisis. Unfortunately, it's a disaster, unfortunately. Hopefully, this hearing will amplify the Sudanese plight and be a call to action for the American public, our colleagues on the Hill, and the international community. I had the privilege of traveling to Sudan in the spring of 2019 and absolutely fell in love with the Sudanese people. The timing of my trip could not have been more perfect. The government was reacting violently to peaceful protests. And in Khartoum, I knew as one of the first elected officials from the U.S. to visit Sudan in a long time, I could make somewhat of an impact. During this trip, I had the good fortune of meeting Dr. Irfan, who now has become a dear friend and a close advisor on all issues related to Sudan. In addition to meeting with the Bashir government officials for the purpose of demanding the release of a Sudanese American who was wrongfully jailed for his participation in a peaceful protest, with the help of Dr. Irfan and the U.S. DCM, I was able to meet with numerous opposition leaders, but not Bashir, obviously, all of these leaders were demanding comprehensive human rights reforms in Sudan. Not a month later, President al-Bashir was removed from power, and the TMC was created as a transitional power. While the situation in Sudan was looking significantly more promising since my initial visit, I warned that there were still entrenched elements in the military created by the Bashir regime, which would continue to be a destabilizing presence. We can see now that our worst nightmares came true, unfortunately, with the threat of widespread famine affecting tens of millions and a full-blown genocidal campaign on the horizon unless the United States and the international community act. We need to end this war and protect the innocent. Dr. Irfan, what can the United States and the international community do to pressure the two parties into a ceasefire and secure safe haven for the displaced people while the war continues?
Thank you, Congressman Bilirakis, for your continuing advocacy for Sudan and Sudan issues. I really appreciate all what you have done since the revolution back in 2019 upon your visit and afterwards, keeping Sudan in the middle of your agenda all the time and putting some of your time to meet with Sudanese people like myself and discussing what can we do in the future. I just want to remind you that the resolution that you put back in 2019 in the summer, if I remember correctly, with Congressman Dan Kildee, Resolution 432, if I remember correctly, supporting the revolution in Sudan and demanding all the forces that was fighting the army at that time and the militia and others to abide to what the Sudanese civilian movement was doing the revolution for and building a democratic, very good country that would be for all Sudanese people. That was a dream. This is what we needed. But that particular resolution has helped the revolution in Sudan, and the revolution came back after some massacre happened during the end of Ramadan back in 2019, unfortunately. So I'm putting all those statements here because the U.S. has a lot to offer. The U.S. can pressurize those two factions that are fighting right now. They are already in Jeddah. I think with more pressure, diplomatic and other pressures, the U.S. can put, and together the international community under the leadership of the United States can put an end to this war. And I think putting an end of this war is a must happen and should be in the agenda for the entire international community. This is unprecedented, catastrophic humanitarian that could be even worse and worse if we don't put that effort from today.
And also, we're not, the focus, the media attention has not been on this particular issue. So I encourage the media to put a microscope over this issue and cover it, because great people, these are wonderful people, salt of the earth, and it's terrible. It's just awful what they're going through, and I feel for them. So, Dr. Afan, again, do you believe the United States can work with Sudanese Americans in the diaspora to coordinate humanitarian efforts, or even as part of a Sudan crisis task force?
Yes, and I think this would be a great opportunity for all Sudanese people that you have met with congressmen before, and everyone. There is a lot of Sudanese people who have been so integrated to the U.S. community here. They have been contributing to the welfare of the United States, and everybody is looking forward right now to stop this war, to work under some guidance, some coalition, some consortium kind of work. Again, I'm talking about a humanitarian crisis that is really unprecedented. So no matter how good we are on what we have done before, because during the revolution, the Sudanese diaspora really did a very good job in supporting that revolution and made it to continue. Again, during the pandemic, there was a huge international global coalition and group for Sudanese people, not only in the US, but globally, that helped the country to go through the COVID-19 pandemic. At this point, I think all Sudanese people are still in shock, and the situation is much larger than a small group of people who can handle it. So we're really appealing for the international community at large, and the US in particular, to help us get organized, stop this war, and look for a better future for Sudan.
I know you're willing. Your community, it's a fantastic community, and I'm very familiar with them, and I know they're willing and able, but they need partners. Do you believe both factions are using food as a weapon in the war?
Yes, I do. And I think my colleagues who are much more experienced, they are in the field doing this work, all the data, the information that are coming from those big organizations, as well as small local organizations. We work with grassroots organizations that are trying to even have small kitchens in areas, cooking food. Unfortunately, when you look at people dying in their houses right now, people who were not able to flee the country in different areas, and the war zone is expanding from one city to another, from one state to another. And just imagine those people are being displaced displaced going from one place to the other. I have family members who have been affected by that, and two others, and millions of people. So this is really a situation where it's very large situation that we really need some help to salvage those lives.
How can we prevent this from happening without causing greater harm to the starving people? In other words, the food is being used as a weapon. How can we prevent this from happening?
I think the special envoy for Sudan, Mr. Tom Prelius, 3 days ago, he tweeted, particularly on the 19th, and he was demanding the two factions to stop and step back from fighting in al-Fashir in particular, and open corridors for pathways for humanitarian aid throughout the country. Not only in al-Fashir, which is facing a catastrophic situation as we are talking right now, but other areas are being equally affected in different regions of Sudan. So by putting that pressure from the US government to open those corridors and pathways for the aid is the only way that we can help those lives to be salvaged at this point.
Okay. What role can the Sudanese doctors, either immigrants and then also maybe first generation Sudanese Americans of Sudanese descent, what role can they play? They have played a major role in the past. I'm familiar with that. But what role can they play to help these wonderful people?
Yes, and this is a very important area that we have more than one organization that groups the Sudanese doctors and other allied healthcare professions in the US here, Sudanese Physician Association and Sudanese Medical Association as well. They have been really doing some work in Sudan, very significant work. Some of them are the only ones who are running work. They have been working with Doctors Without Borders. We have been working with other organizations in the field, moving from one city when there is no security to try to establish some healthcare work in other areas. I think what we need at this point is trying to unify efforts, trying to bring all those people together, because if we augment and if we work together, I think the outcome can be much better. With the very insecure situation in Sudan, we're going to depend, as what's happening right now, on volunteer Sudanese who are in the field. There are still some doctors in Sudan who are decided to stay in the war zone and still helping people back in their own localities, in their own cities. And if we can just make their efforts to be recognized and make sure that their safety to come first and be able to supply them with all what they need to help helping people back, that would be really very important. So a good coalition of all Sudanese doctors in the United States, among other Sudanese in different professions, will be of.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Doctor. We appreciate you very much, and I look forward to working with you and your colleagues to assist these wonderful people. Again, I fell in love with these people when I went to Sudan. Okay, I'm going to yield back, but I want to give Representative Omar as much time as she'd like to ask questions and make statements with regard to that. So she is recognized for as much time as she will take. And then we'll probably, more than likely, will end the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My apologies, I had to run to another engagement, but really grateful for the panel for briefing us today. Ms. Ahmed, I wanted to start by saying this. The work that you have done, the work the emergency response rooms have done is in impossible circumstances is deeply inspiring to me. I want you to know that I have advocated at the highest levels for the U.S. Government to provide you direct support Not only do I see this as the most effective way to provide humanitarian assistance during the war, I see this as an investment in civilian leadership when this war is over. I've not given up the dream of the 2019 that Sudan will one day be run by a civilian-led government. The work that you have all done in the last 13 months has kept that hope alive. You have my sincere respect and admiration. I want to ask you about another thing that I have repeatedly raised with the Biden administration, which is the role of the United Arab Emirates has played in fueling this conflict. Last year, I introduced a resolution to block American weapon sales to the UAE because they have been violating the UN arms embargo in Darfur. From your perspective, what has the UAE's role been in continuing this conflict?
Thank you for your advocacy for the localize the fund for the emergency response rooms. Of course, we are aimed to govern and lead this country, and right now we are the one who are governing the situation on the ground with other civil society organizations. For the role of the countries in the regions that fueling the conflict, I've been asked many times for a unified strategy from the United States to stop this bad interference of fueling the conflict. We have been known that the UAE supporting the RSF financially and by recruiting some multinational or multi-regional militias and help them to coming in Sudan and fighting with RSF and supporting RSF by recruiting and by money and by weapons as well, and even by international advocacy in some areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable. We've all seen pictures of some of the weapons that the RSF have used, being American weapons, and we know that is getting to them via UAE. Are there any other countries that we should be paying attention to that are fueling the conflict?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. But because UAE become famous and become very obvious that they are fueling the conflict, especially by their supporting for RSF. But if we know any other countries, of course, we are letting you know.
I appreciate that. Again, I'm it's incredibly heartening to see the ways in which the Sudanese people have organized themselves to fight the devastations that are caused by the civil war, find ways to collaborate and coordinate with the international community in providing humanitarian aid. And I think it is imperative that those of us who are in the United States, who are in positions of leadership, to continue to push the administration to try to find every dollar that is possible in supporting Sudan, but also in supporting Sudan in ending the conflict and finding a way to negotiate for a ceasefire and allow for the Sudanese people to be able to decide the ways in which they should be governed. I know that it's been a really long time that this suffering has lasted, and it is my wishful prayer that there will be end in sight soon. I don't know if we have anyone else coming, but I want to thank the chairs of the co-chairs of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. I want to thank the rest of the panelists and you. We will continue to shed light on what is happening in Sudan and continue to advocate for the people of Sudan. Thank you so much. And with that, we are adjourned.